Today, I want to talk about a subject that I think that we've all been kind of skirting around for the last year and a half or so, which is the situation in Europe. I know it's a lot more specific than some of my other videos, but I think it's important enough to kind of highlight this. And the reason I'm thinking about this now is I read an excellent report by the Baker Institute, which was published, I think, in September, just a couple of weeks ago, September 13th, I think it was. And I encourage all of you to get this report. But basically, it talks about the predicament that Europe has found itself in. Europe for many years has kind of allowed itself to fall into the Russian trap. Right, even before the war started, Russia was, supplying about 40% of European gas imports. And even before the war started, February last year, we had seen Russia continuously use gas as a weapon, and they're shut off gas supplies to Ukraine in the past, and even leading up to the war, they were playing games with the gas storage in Europe, etc. But it seemed that the European governments just didn't think that they were going to be ever get squeezed by the Russian bear. Unfortunately, it's all come up to roost now. The Baker Institute report talked about the fact that in this situation, even in I think the next 1 or 2 years, Europe's going to be facing a shortfall of 100 BCM a year, which is roughly 70 million tons of LNG. And this shortfall is basically the gap between the domestic supply, the pipelines from North Africa and from Norway, a little bit of gas that they still expect from Russia, all the long term LNG imports versus the total demand that they still expect to be. So Europe's going into a situation where we're going to see a long term supply demand gap of over 70 million tons of LNG per year. Should really do something about this. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be doing a lot about this. According to my own calculations, of all the deals that were signed with US long-term contracts last year, which is just in 2022, the end users in Europe only signed about 10 to 15% of all those volumes. That was the US volume signed under long-term contracts signed after the war started last year in the calendar year 2022. And according to the Baker Institute, Europe has only signed about 10% of the worldwide long-term LNG contracted since the war started till now. So for some reason, Europe is just not signing long-term contract deals. So it's basically deciding it's going to rely on the spot market to fill its demand gap. Now, there's a couple of things I can hope for. I guess it can hope for that the war won't last very long. And if the war doesn't last very long, everything can go back to normal. I just don't think that's the case. I think the war looks like it's going to last for a lot longer than we think it is. It looks like it's getting to a bit of a quagmire. And even if the war ends tomorrow, I just don't see how we can just allow Russian gas to flow in without anything. And in the kind of the best case scenario is Russian gas will flow, but there'll be a bit of a surcharge to pay for all the reconstruction of all the damage that's happened in Ukraine. And that surcharge will just raise that gas bill a lot more because gas will be the largest exporter that Russia has. Kind of similar to what we did for the Iran-Iraq war the Iraq war. After that, when Iraq started supplying again, there was a bit of a surcharge in Iraqi oil. So I guess in a best case scenario, the war ends, gas starts flowing again. Everybody forgets about what happened in this last year and a half, and we start buying Russian gas again, but maybe at a higher price. I just don't think that's a likely case. Maybe the second option is that somehow miraculously European gas production goes up and more pipelines come in from other parts, Eastern Med, etc., etc. This is an important week because next week is the end, so theoretically, the end of the Groningen field. The Groningen field has been producing for 50 years. The Groningen field was the powerhouse of European gas. The Groningen field actually really started the European gas business, and it determined how European gas will ever be priced. And it's determined, the whole TTF, all that stuff is because of the Groningen field, which is in northern Netherlands. That field is going to end production, not because the reserves are ending, it's because of political reasons, because the farming community in the area is suffered a few, I don't know how serious they were, but some earthquakes. But in the end of the day, we're letting a very, very small percentage of the population that might be impacted by these earthquakes because the lack of the ground has reduced, the strength of the ground has been reduced because of the production of the gas over the last 50 years, we're letting a very, very small amount of people in rural northern Netherlands determine the fate of European gas. But that's a political situation the Dutch have made. But in the end of the day, I think it's important to realize that European gas is on a terminal decline. But no matter how we look at it, we're not going to see more production, incremental production coming out of anywhere in Europe, especially the North Sea. Scotland, all these places are pretty much getting out of the gas business. Norway has a little bit more, but who knows how much new stuff they can bring into the production. So we're in a situation where domestic gas is declining. Pipelines are not going to be increased from North Africa. The pipelines from Eastern Med are a long way away. And for some reason, the Europeans are still not signing long-term LNG deals. Is it because they think that the demand of gas is going to decline because of all this great renewable stuff that we're talking about? Well, the renewable stuff really will come along. It is coming along, but it's not coming along at the pace they expect. It's not coming out at a cheap cost. So who's going to pay for this expensive renewable energy? And at the end of the day, I think we're realizing that renewables can't replace everything that we do with gas anyway. So Europe, I think, is heading off a bit of a train wreck. It's basically saying, look, we can't sign long-term deals because we have all these net zero commitments. We have still a massive demand supply gap that is 100 BCM a year that we are not willing to fill by signing long-term LNG deals. And so you get beholden to the spot market. I think a great example of this, or the great proof of this, is what happened just a few weeks ago. We had the threat of strikes in Australia with the Wheatstone and the Gorgon Chevron projects. It really didn't impact long-term prices in Asia much, but it had a massive impact on the TTF price in Holland, in Europe, even though Europe doesn't import any gas, LNG, directly from Australia. And that's just because they basically realize that if those two plants do go down, there'll be a pull on the spot market, and this pull on the spot market will impact European gas prices. So it's kind of ironic that we have a threat of strikes in Australia, and the biggest price impact was not in Asia, where Australian gas actually gets exported to, but it was in Europe, where they have no Australian gas coming to, but they have exposed to the spot market. So that basically says that Europe's now depending on the spot market for its future energy needs. And there's all kinds of numbers out there, but I think I read something like, what is it? I'm just kind of looking up right now. But Europe would have spent, had they had signed up US LNG contracts over the last 18 months, like the Chinese did, like a lot of the Asians did, like the trading companies did, they would have saved $100 billion instead of being exposed to the spot market. And so, what does this really mean? I think, somehow we have a problem that the politicians have promised net zero, and the shareholders of a lot of these banks and other financiers and users are now facing protests outside their shareholder meeting by the green groups who complain that we shouldn't sign LNG. When Total tried to bring in an LNG ship into its new receiving terminal in France last week, Greenpeace was out there spray painting on the side of it, gas kills. So you have that on one side, and on the other side, we still have a massive demand for energy. The only answer is either to continue paying these exorbitant amounts of money, and all you're doing is making electricity and energy more and more expensive, and until a point that you drive your industry away. And once you drive your industry away, it really comes back. So you're really hurting structurally your long term by refusing to sign long term cheap gas supplies. You're actually condemning your economic future. And I think another interesting implication of all of this is as the world knows that the Europe will continue bidding up spot prices, countries, especially poorer countries that can't sign up long-term deals because they don't have the credit facilities and are dependent on the cheap spot market, are now thinking, hey, why should I be dependent on the cheap spot market? Because the cheap spot market is not going to be cheap anymore because Europe can outbid me every time there's a crisis. They will now decide to build more coal. And we're seeing this already happen. India is going to build more coal. Of course, China is building more coal. And we're going to see people like Pakistan now build more coal because they see coal as kind of independent from some of these crazy fluctuations on the spot market, largely driven by the Europeans driving up the spot market because they refuse to sign up the long-term deals. So these countries go out there and they build coal-fired power plants. These coal-fired power plants have a life of at least 30, 40, 50 years. And now we are basically saying, hey, we're going to use coal for the next 40, 50 years when we could have been using gas. And if our end goal was to reduce gas consumption and reduce carbon emissions, all we've done is we may have reduced carbon emissions in Europe because of the high prices and driving the industry away, et cetera, et cetera. But also now we are just condemning the rest of the world to use more coal for longer periods of time. And this has a direct implication on projects like mine. I'm trying to raise funding for my new LNG project, and the source of the capital in the past have been a lot of the European banks, the European financial institutions, in funds, and European off-takers. And now all of them are saying, look, I would love to invest in your project, but I can't because I have a net zero commitment. Well, with a net zero commitment, they're basically saying, oh, by 2030, I can't be having any more gas, but I know I need gas and I know I have a massive demand shortfall, but publicly I can't admit that. And so I can't invest in any project that's going to start producing after 2030 because I'm supposed to be net zero at that point. And also, by the way, I want short term LNG and I only want it for 6 or 7 years. I don't want it after that point, which is why the Europeans are going to places like Qatar and saying, hey, give us short term LNG. And the Qataris are saying, no, you want short term LNG, you got to sign long term contracts. And in the end, they just end up buying more in the spot market, paying more for it. When they could be getting cheap Henry Hub linked American gas at cheap prices for long, long periods of time with very little volatility. Instead, they're buying short term spot market prices, largely driven by oil prices, etc., and driving up the price and condemning the rest of the world to pollute more and buy more coal. So that's kind of my things that are on my mind today. So obviously, comments welcome. I look forward to seeing what you have to say about all this. Bit controversial, but I think always interesting. Thanks. Bye.